The president's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, has announced his resignation. Let's bring in our correspondents and our experts. And Caitlin, you've been doing some important reporting on all of this. He's now about to be gone. Another senior official, one of the closest officials to the president, deciding he's had enough, moving on.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting what it came to. This is what he's leaving over, these tariffs that the president announced very hastily last week. And to give you some context for that, this is a decision that had been decided last week by the president on his own against the will of Gary Cohn. And in the days leading up to it, they had been discussing it. Gary Cohn was advising him not to do it, but people like the trade advisor Peter Navarro and the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross were pushing for the president to continue to do this. And as of Thursday, when the president was meeting with these industry executives from aluminum and steel industries, Gary Cohn and them were under the impression that the president was not going to announce these tariffs. And then he called the reporters in at the last minute, announced these very stiff tariffs that would significantly impact the economy, and without heeding Gary Cohn's advice in a way. So that was really the final straw that kind of broke the camel's back for Gary Cohn. It's certainly a little bit of a surprise that it came today, even to those close to Gary Cohn. But they did believe at some point he was going to leave the White House. He and the president are not aligned. They do not have the same views on many things except tax reform. That is the one thing that really brought the two of them together. So it's not a total surprise.
Yeah, Gary Cohn supports free trade. He's a former president of Goldman Sachs. And it's interesting, Rebecca, he waited till after 4 p.m. when the markets closed on Wall Street to make this announcement. But look at the Dow futures right now. They're dropping big time because Gary Cohn was seen as a source of support, strength for this establishment Republican economic agenda.
That's right. He was a steady hand in a very unpredictable White House. And it's different, Wolf, when you see someone of his stature in the White House, the top economic advisor to the president, step down, as opposed to someone like Hope Hicks, who was obviously very close to the president, but she was the communications director. This is a big deal, and it could have real world consequences. The first and most immediate being these tariffs that the president is planning to impose. Gary Cohn was the voice in the White House really urging him against that. And now the stock markets are panicking because without Gary Cohn, who will be in this White House to speak up against these tariffs?
You know, it's interesting, Jeffrey, that the president doubling down on the steel and aluminum tariffs and doubling down on, well, you know what, a trade war, it could be very good.
Well, I think this is an interesting lesson in, the ethics and principles of Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn made a big show of being disgusted with the president's behavior after Charlottesville, his sympathy for neo-Nazis, and he says, oh, I might resign over the president's racism. Well, he managed to stomach the racism. What he couldn't take was tariffs. And I think if you want to weigh the moral imperatives of the two, it really doesn't reflect all that well on Gary Cohn.
Although at the same time, I mean, his job was to advise the president on economic matters. It wasn't to advise him on, being a moral leader. And so if the president wasn't even going to listen to Gary Cohn's advice on an economic matter like tariffs, there's nothing bigger than that. And so what could he possibly accomplish in this White House?
In the president's statement, David, he did praise Gary Cohn for his help in getting the tax cuts through.
Exactly. But I do think, to Rebecca's point, that this undercuts a major narrative that President Trump cultivated when he ran for president, has wanted to hang on to. This idea that, okay, he'd never been in government. He didn't know what he was doing on all the granular issues of managing a federal bureaucracy, but that he was going to be a CEO, hire the best people, hire someone who could advise him on just these issues, a president of Goldman Sachs. And this completely undercuts that. He's not listening to the best advice that he's getting.
And there are others, Matthew Rosenberg of the New York Times is with us as well, who may be on very, very thin ice, days numbered in the White House right now, including the president's national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster. We've been reporting he could be out before the end of the month.
I mean, for so many people in this White House, it's been an odd fit. With Gary Cohn, obviously, the economic policies he wants don't match up with what Trump wanted. McMaster, General McMaster, the national security advisor, has come from a fairly interventionist background. In the military, he has pushed for a number of policies that the president was never going to agree with, and there's a personal issue with the two of them. The president just flat out doesn't like him, finds him condescending and lecturing, and I think at some point that's.
What do you make of John Bolton, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN during the Bush administration coming to the White House today, having another one-on-one meeting with the president.
I mean, it certainly looks like they're interviewing for the job. Bolton's been through this before. The president didn't think he had the right look for the job the first time around, but maybe this time it is Bolton's.
But Bolton is famous as a neoconservative and an interventionist and a big supporter of the Iraq War, which the president has denounced over and over again. So like, what is the president's foreign policy if he doesn't like McMaster, but he likes John Bolton? I thought he was against being a neoconservative.
Yeah, but this is what the president does. He brings all these people in with these vastly different views, and he actually is a big fan of John Bolton's. He's liked him for some time, and John Bolton is actually often at the White House every few months. So it's worth noting that he is there a lot. He was there today. We broke that he was there meeting with the president. It's unclear exactly what they were discussing, whether it was a job offer or whatnot. That has certainly been the rumor, but this goes to show what the president does. Today, he was bemoaning any kind of chaos in the White House. He says that's not true, that things are running fine. And sure, there's some people he still wants to change, but it's only because he's, quote, seeking perfection in his staff. But this is what the president likes. He likes to bring in all these people with vastly different worldviews and watch them fight it out for his attention, to have his ear on what policy they're going to decide. And we saw that just last week with Gary Cohn, Peter Navarro, and Wilbur Ross.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
How's that? Well, I was just going to say, how's that working out for him? You know, bringing all these people in. No one's left.
Well, I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it's what the
Ivanka.
president does.
Right, no,
well, but I mean, you know, at some point, you know, you need to have at least some stability.
Jeffrey, I don't know if you forget, but there was a story, I think in the New York Times the other day, that the president was actually encouraging John Kelly, the White House chief of staff, to maybe convince Jared Kushner to leave the White House, go back to New York.
Well, I mean, you know, the idea that you could have close to 100% turnover in 13 months, I mean, this has never happened before in American history, in the history of the presidency. And, you know, I suppose people just make up their own minds about whether that's a good idea or not. Look, unemployment's low, so maybe that's the answer to everything. But, I mean, it's just surreal.
It's government by reality show.
And David, look at this. We'll put up on the screen some of the people who have left the Trump administration. You see all those in senior positions, important positions. President denies is there any chaos. He says more departures are on the way. In that tweet, he made it clear that, and I'll read you that one sentence, I still have some people that I want to change, always seeking perfection. Clearly, Gary Cohn was one of those people. He offered his resignation 24 hours ago. So this morning when the president tweeted that, he knew Gary Cohn was on the way out.
Right, and it's becoming increasingly clear, to your point, Wolf, that when he says he's seeking perfection, he's seeking some kind of mix of people that you're describing that essentially gets him where he wants to go optically to present a united front of a White House. But when you have a president who doesn't have core beliefs on foreign policy, doesn't have core beliefs on the traditional Republican view of trade, then you wind up with this.
Matthew, let me just get your thoughts, because you report on this all the time. The president is moving quickly on these tariffs for steel and aluminum, irritating some of the closest U.S. allies in the world.
It's amazing. This is the president who's come in and he says, you know, he doesn't seem to want what Republicans traditionally wanted, and Democrats, mostly the entire foreign policy establishment, which is close relationships with real allies. And Britain, a number of our allies are furious about this, and he's undermining them, and it's hard to see what the end game is here.
You know, and he's undermining a lot of his closest allies here in Washington up on Capitol Hill.
That's right. Well, if he rolled out this tariff plan, I mean, you could hardly call it a rollout. He announced this tariff plan without consulting Congress, without consulting the Republican leadership in Congress. This was a surprise to Speaker Paul Ryan, to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Ryan has been urging the president to rethink this, just like Gary Cohn. He didn't consult his lawyers. There wasn't a legal review of this. It really harkens back to his decision on transgender military members, which he also did in a hurry. It was a rash decision, but he did it because it was an emotional decision. He thought it would help him politically. He was angry about the way things were going, and so he thought that that snap decision would help right the ship. Same thing here. He thinks that this is going to help him politically, but it's really burning a lot of bridges at the same time.
But we're trying to rationalize. We are trying to rationalize a president here who thrives on chaos. He bemoans it. He says there is no chaos, but he loves this chaos. This is what he enjoys. And he's actually had these views on trade for some time. He said he was going to do this throughout the campaign. So you can act like you're surprised by it, but you can't be, you're
Very quickly, Jeffrey.
You can't be surprised by it.
Right.
Well, just another example of impulsive action was the first Muslim ban on people coming in on people coming from majority Muslim countries, which was quickly struck down by the courts, and now they're trying to get the third version upheld by the courts. So it's one thing to react emotionally and do tariffs and do the Muslim ban and do the transgender ban on the military, but you have to follow the law, and you have to have political supporters, and he hasn't done too well on those.